Good morning, everyone. The court has received the memorandum concerning the admissibility of statements involving this witness, and this morning received the opposition filed by the defense. Without further argument, I'm going to make these rulings. The statement. Looking at page 3 of the prosecution's memo and page 1 of the defense memo. Actually, I think it's a little clearer, easier to refer to, on the defense memo. So number 1 statement. Vinny Amen told him that signs had been posted at Neverland Ranch directing security personnel not to allow the Arvizo children to leave the ranch. I'm not going to allow him to repeat that hearsay. Number 2. Vinny Amen and Mark Schaffel used the word, killers. I am going to allow that. Number 3. Mr. Amen informed Mr. Provencio that a tape recorder had secretly been used. I'm not going to allow that. That Mr. Schaffel informed Provencio that Janet Arvizo didn't want to go to Brazil, wanted to leave Neverland, did leave Neverland, and that it was an escape. I'm breaking that into 2 parts and I'm not allowing the first part, but I will allow him to say that Mr. Schaffel informed Mr. Provencio that they, the Arvizo family, had escaped. So with those rulings, I think we can go forward.
Any discussion about Brazil at all?
Excuse me?
Any discussion about his knowledge for Brazil, the family going to Brazil? All of that is out?
What I'm ruling on is that hearsay statements made to him by Mr. Schaffel that she didn't want to go to Brazil is not admissible.
But that the family had escaped is admissible.
Yes.
Can I have a moment with the witness to make sure he understands the extent of the rulings before we begin?
Absolutely. I'm going to leave, and when you're ready, tell the bailiff and we'll have the jury brought in.
Thank you so much.
We have another motion that we filed.
I'm looking up some law on that motion. I received it this morning.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Good morning.
In unison, good morning, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Provencio, good morning.
Good morning.
Did you remember the name of the bank that Neverland Valley Entertainment used during the course of the time that you were employed there?
Yes, the U.S. Bank.
Beverly was, in fact, the person that you dealt with when you worked in conjunction with that bank?
Yes.
I had asked you a few questions about your work in lining up artists for the presentation of the What More Can I Give? Were artists that were going to be performing on that song going to be compensated or paid for their performance?
Objection. Foundation.
This is what he was doing.
The objection is overruled.
You can answer.
No, they were not going to be compensated. It was going to be for the next We Are the World charity single, which was going to be What More Can I Give?
Did you need Mr. Jackson's assistance in being able to get those artists to perform?
Well, yeah, he was on conference calls, and calling the artists, and, like we were in a car and he talked to Britney Spears, with us, on the phone. Stuff like that.
Alright, Mr. Provencio, you mentioned yesterday, you made a reference to 2 voices in your discussion about Mr. Jackson. What do you mean?
Well, there's the
Objection. Vague.
Overruled. You may answer.
Go ahead.
There's the, there's the voice you hear on television and stuff, and then there's the upset voice, I guess you could call it. The voice.
How are they different?
Well, one is deeper.
Objection. Relevance. Foundation.
Overruled.
Go ahead.
One is a deeper voice.
And you have heard both of those voices?
Oh, yeah.
Are they uniquely distinct?
I think so, yes.
Did you ever talk with Mr. Jackson about his use of cell phones?
I just saw him use people's cell phones.
Did you ever see him use his own cell phone?
I don't think he owned one.
Did you ever have the ability to contact him by cell phone?
If we needed to get him, like if we were in the office and needed to get a hold of him?
Yes.
We would call the bodyguard or we would call someone that we knew was close to him at that time, because he would travel or he would be someplace, and so we'd have to get a hold of somebody to get a hold of him. So he didn't have his own cell phone direct.
And that was your understanding during the entirety of the time that you...
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah, you couldn't get a hold of him directly. You can't get a hold of Michael Jackson directly. Like, BBR ring. Oh, hi, it was, it was, you had to go to the bodyguard or you had to go through somebody, and then, that was always my experience.
Did he ever make a comment to you about being like fog?
Objection. Leading.
Sustained.
Did he ever talk to you about how he liked to travel or move around?
Objection. Leading.
Well,
Overruled. You may answer.
we were at the Beverly Hills Hotel, and I had made a comment that I liked. I was talking about anonymity.
Objection. Non-responsive. Move to strike.
I believe it is responsive.
All right. Overruled.
Go ahead.
I was speaking about anonymity, and I remember because I was drinking my smart water. And I was talking about anonymity and being in New York and how I loved the fact that I could be any place I want, and nobody knows me, and I like that feeling, compared to someone like him, where he can't go anywhere unless he's dressed up or disguised. And then he had made a comment that he could go places and be like no place, which was like being like fog. It was like a strange reference. But that he would have to be in costume. Like when he was at Universal, he said that he dressed like a clown and walked around in disguise so he wouldn't be mobbed essentially.
Did he explain the term fog to you?
Well, that's what he said. I don't, I just thought it was strange.
Now, you mentioned that the charities had not been decided as to which charities that were going to be the beneficiaries of this song. What more can I give? At some point in time was it resolved who the beneficiary would be?
Objection. Relevance.
Sustained.
Over the time that you had the opportunity to listen to conversations between Mr. Schaffel and Mr. Jackson, did you ever hear any use of diminutives or nicknames by either of them for the other?
Just that Mark called him Arnold. But they were good friends. I mean, they were buddies.
Alright, and where did Arnold come from?
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, Arnold was like, Arnold, and then Michael would laugh. I just thought it was kind of like an endearment term.
Objection. Move to strike.
Stricken.
Did you hear that often?
Yeah, when they were around each other, we were in the studio, we would go and have meetings with Michael to talk about the benefit single.
What? You mentioned the term French fries. What was that?
Money.
Excuse me?
Money.
And what does that mean?
Typically Michael wanted money, so, I need French fries, or, French fries, was about money.
Did that term come up in conversations frequently?
Well, yeah.
Did you learn over time what it was in reference to?
That Michael needed money.
Did either Mr. Jackson or Mr. Schaffel tell you that was what that term meant?
Well, Michael was always asking for money, or.
Objection.
Everybody has to make money.
Objection. Move to strike.
Stricken.
In the conversations that you overheard between Mr. Schaffel and Mr. Jackson, were there discussions about money passing from one to the other?
Yeah.
Frequently?
Well, yeah, we were. You had to make money to, the single had to take off, and there were other things Michael wanted to do, and he needed his cash, like after the RMAs and.
Objection. Non-responsive. Move to strike.
All strike the last phrase.
Did you ever hear Michael Jackson specifically ask for cash from Mr. Schaffel? Money to be delivered in cash?
Yes.
On a number of occasions?
Couple times, yes.
Were you present when that happened, when money was, in fact, transferred from Mr. Schaffel to Mr. Jackson?
No, I saw checks.
Objection. Non-responsive. Move to strike.
Overruled. Next question.
In November 2001, did something happen that changed the working relationship between you, Mark Schaffel, and Mr. Jackson?
Yes. Mark got fired.
Got fired by whom?
Neverland Valley wasn't closed. Mark got fired, though.
And did you actually see or witness the firing of Mr. Schaffel?
Yeah, it came through a fax machine.
It was a letter?
Yeah, it was a letter.
From whom?
A guy named Zia, I believe.
Do you know his last name?
Marauder or something.
Do you know who Zia is?
He was just one of Michael's lawyers, crony lawyers.
Objection. Move to strike.
Did I hear that right?
Well, there's many lawyers.
Just a moment.
Oh, sorry.
I'll strike the last phrase in that answer.
You understand Zia to be one of the attorneys, is that right?
Yes.
And this letter was received by whom?
By Mark in his office.
All right, but did you see it?
Yes.
Did you see it when it actually came in?
Yes.
Did you see it before or after Mr. Schaffel saw it?
We pretty much saw it at the same time, because it was, you're fired, when I handed it to him.
Was there some level of controversy that?
Objection. Non-responsive. Move to strike.
I'll strike the last sentence. Leave the first phrase in, that they saw it at the same time.
Was there some controversy that was going on at that time involving Mr. Schaffel?
Objection. Relevance. Foundation.
I can lay foundation for it.
And leading.
But it would require some discussion.
The objection is overruled.
Go ahead.
What was the question?
Was there some controversy that was going on involving Mark Schaffel at that time?
Well, they.
Just answer yes or no on that.
Oh, okay, yes.
What was it?
Objection. Relevance. Foundation. 352.
Overruled. You may answer.
What was it?
His past.
And what was it about his past?
He was in adult entertainment.
Objection. Objection. 352. Foundation. Relevance.
Overruled.
What was it about his past?
He was in adult entertainment.
What type of adult entertainment? What was he doing?
Objection. Relevance. 352.
Sustained.
All right, and he was fired. But this operation was out of his home, is that correct?
Right. Neverland Valley Entertainment kept on operating.
Up until this time in November. And do you remember if it was early or late November of '01?
It was. I think it was like the third week in November.
Up until this time in November of '01, was there fairly continuous communication between Mr. Schaffel and Mr. Jackson and even between you and Mr. Jackson?
There was continuous communication between those two definitely, and then I would only come into it when it was just business.
Okay. And the communication between Mr. Jackson and Mr. Schaffel was communication that you were able to personally witness, is that right?
Right. He would have him on the speakerphone.
Objection. Non-responsive. Move to strike.
Overruled. Next question.
All right. Now, after the firing of Mr. Schaffel, was there any communication that you were able to personally witness between Mr. Schaffel and Mr. Jackson?
No.
And did that go on for some period of time?
Yeah, for quite a while.
All right. Now, Neverland Valley Entertainment was housed in Mr. Schaffel's home, is that correct?
Yeah, it was a Michael Jackson, Mark Schaffel company housed in his home.
So what happened to you at that point?
Well, we just kind of went into limbo, because without Michael's cooperation on the single, we couldn't really get more artists to sing on it, and everything just kind of went screeching to a halt.
All right. What did you continue to do?
We started working on, finances, how much we have spent on the project, getting the receipts together. Getting the books together, essentially, to make sure that, things were, on the up and up and.
Who is we? You say, we.
Mark and I.
So Mark was still working there?
Yeah, Mark, Christian, I was still there.
Christian Robinson?
Yes, Christian Robinson.
What was he doing during this time?
He was doing the same thing we were doing, just getting filing done and, there had been a mountain of things. Everybody had been traveling, trying to get artists.
Objection. Non-responsive. Move to strike.
Overruled. Next question.
Did you continue to draw salary during this time?
Yeah.
Do you know if Mr. Schaffel continued to draw salary?
I'm pretty sure.
Was that bank account still in existence at US Bank?
Yes.
And were either you or Schaffel periodically dealing with that bank with regards to funds?
Well, yeah, we had to go in and see Beverly and.
For how long did this continue, that you continued working in Mr. Schaffel's home on this project?
Well, at the beginning, we took a break. We just kind of took a breather. And then we just went in like gangbusters and got all the paperwork together. So that went on for like 7, 8 months, something like that.
And for the next 7 or 8 months, was there any contact between you and Michael Jackson?
No, he wasn't calling the office.
Pardon me?
He wasn't calling the office.
And there was no contact between Mr. Schaffel and Mr. Jackson that you were personally witness to, is that correct?
Correct.
Was there any progress that was being made toward the development of What More Can I Give?
No, everything was at a dead halt. Other than, it was trying to be. Mark was trying to work on things. But, as far as I was concerned, getting artists in the studio and everything, and recording and other things, everything was at a dead halt.
Did you still have your point? Do you know what I'm talking about, the point?
I didn't. Yeah.
Did you still have, that's the point of the interest, 1% interest in the song, is that right?
Yeah, I still had it in the beginning. And then I started debating whether I was going to hold on to it.
Objection. Non-responsive. Move to strike.
All strike after, in the beginning.
Mr. Provencio, what did you do with your 1% interest in What More Can I Give?
I gave it back to Michael.
How did you do that?
I signed documents at Wahoo's Fish Taco on Wilshire, and basically it says that I give my point back to Michael.
Who did you furnish those documents to?
To Mark Schaffel, but it had Michael's name. I read it. It said that, this hereby, you are giving your point back.
Objection. Non-responsive. Move to strike.
The last portion as stricken.
Why did you do that? Why did you return your 1% back to Michael Jackson?
Objection. Relevance.
Overruled.
Go ahead and explain.
Well, there was 2 things. I was really kind of just wanting to get away from all of them, and I really didn't feel like I deserved to keep something that was Michael's song, and make money on something that I didn't really. It was Michael's song, so I felt that it was the right thing to do. And I just wanted to I had a good time while I had it, and, I wasn't rich before, so, I can't miss anything I didn't have. So I just gave it back because I thought that was the right thing to do.
Mr. Provencio, during that period of time, did Mark Schaffel continue to work with Neverland Valley Entertainment?
Yes.
Even after he was fired?
Yes, because Neverland Valley Entertainment still existed.
Were there other projects that Neverland Valley Entertainment was engaged in other than What More Can I Give?
Objection. Foundation.
Overruled. You may answer.
I'm sorry, Your Honor?
Yes, he may answer.
Go ahead, please.
The rebuttal specials, the RMA Awards in Las Vegas. Essentially the Bambus in Germany.
Now, the Bambus in Germany, tell us what that is.
Well, that's.
Objection. Relevance.
Sustained.
Did Mark Schaffel attend any activities with Michael Jackson during the latter, at any time during 2001 or 2002?
Objection. Foundation.
Sustained.
Were you present during the attendance of any activities with Mark Schaffel and Michael Jackson after he had been fired?
Yeah.
Where?
Went to Gary, Indiana.
What happened at Gary, Indiana?
We went to Michael's hometown.
And Mr. Schaffel was there?
Yeah, that's the last time I talked to Michael, was there.
Okay. Do you remember when that was?
June 2003, I think.
Let me go back, if we can, please, to early 2003, January 2003. Did you know in January 2003 a woman by the name of Catherine Mylofsky?
Yes.
Did I pronounce her name correctly?
I can't even pronounce her name. Yeah, I believe so.
Okay. Who is Catherine Mylofsky, to your knowledge?
She was a press person, a really nice press person.
Okay. From where? Do you know?
Well, she worked at one of the major networks.
And do you know in which country?
Yeah, Great Britain. And then she came over to America.
Did she send something to you or to Mr. Schaffel that you saw in early January 2003?
Yeah, the transcript to Martin Bashir, January 24th.
So the Martin Bashir, what was that exactly? Do you know the name of it?
It was the transcript. I'm sorry?
Do you know the name of it?
Living with Michael Jackson.
Alright. Now, had it been aired at the time that she sent it?
No.
Did she actually have a conversation with you?
About?
About living with Michael Jackson and the transcript.
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled. You may answer yes or no.
Just yes or no.
Yes.
Was this conversation with her before or after she sent you the transcript?
Both before and after.
You had multiple conversations with her?
Yeah, it was. She had warned us it was going to be very damaging to Michael.
Objection. Hearsay. Move to strike.
Tends to explain their conduct thereafter.
Well, it's non-responsive. Sustained.
Mr. Provencio, when you received the transcript, did you read it?
Yes, on the 24th.
Was this before the documentary had been aired either in Europe or in the United States?
Yes.
Did you understand the impact of that transcript when you read it?
Oh, yeah.
Objection. Leading.
Overruled.
The answer is in?
Yes.
Alright. At some point in time, did you begin getting phone calls at Neverland Valley Entertainment?
Oh, yeah, the phone went ballistic.
Was that before or after the first showing of Living with Michael Jackson?
It was actually before, because other press people had, I guess, received the transcript, too, or got a hold of it.
And when you say, don't tell me what the content of the conversations were, but just give me a sense of how much, you say the phone went ballistic. How many calls were you getting? How often?
Well, if an octopus could pick up a phone every 2 seconds, that's how many phone calls we were getting. So literally the phone just rang and rang and rang and rang.
For the entire time?
Oh, yeah, day and night.
Was it people other than the press?
Well, first it was European press and then it was the American press, North American press.
Was the American showing a few days after the European showing?
Excuse me?
The American showing of Living with Michael Jackson, to your understanding, was a few days after the European showing?
Yes, like 2 or 3 days.
And after that, were there plenty of phone calls?
Yeah, it was crazy.
Did it go on for some period of time?
Well, yeah, it was an engagement. You had to, you had to take the phone calls, or people would just keep calling.
Alright, now, without getting into what, were the questions geared toward specific areas of the content of that documentary?
Objection. Hearsay and leading.
Leading for a reason. I'm trying to narrow the focus, Your Honor.
Just a moment. The objection is overruled.
Did you understand the question?
Yes, they were asking. The press was asking primarily 2 questions.
Objection.
Hold on.
Hearsay.
Sustained.
I'll ask you specifically, listen to the question. Were there specific areas, without getting into what they were there specific areas in particular that the press were inquiring about?
Yes.
Alright, was one of those areas the issue of the child?
Objection. Leading.
For a reason.
The objection is overruled.
Was one of those areas the issue of the child?
Yes.
As to that issue, what were they inquiring about?
Objection. Hearsay. Foundation.
Overruled.
Go ahead.
What was their question?
Yes. Who were they inquiring about?
Who was this boy Michael was sleeping with?
Was that asked often?
Yeah, a lot.
Was that asked as much as any other inquiry, without getting into any of the other inquiries?
Yeah, that was the number one.
Now, did things change at Neverland Valley Entertainment after the screening of Living with Michael Jackson?
Well, yeah, it was in high gear again, and they were going to make rebuttals.
Objection. Non-responsive. Move to strike.
After in high gear again, I'll strike that.
Were there other people brought in now to Neverland Valley Entertainment to deal with this crisis?
Yeah, well, Frank's always been around. But Vinny was brought in but they were, and Stuart Backerman.
Okay. Is Stuart Backerman somebody that you knew prior to the screening of Living with Michael Jackson?
Oh, God, no. Nobody knew him, so, no.
What was Mr. Backerman's role?
He was going to be the press person.
Did he work out of Mr. Schaffel's residence as well?
Yes, at first, and then he was working at a hotel down the street. And they would come into the office.
Did you know an Anne Gabriel or Anne Kite?
I only knew that they had her around for like a minute, and then she was gone. So,
Did you know of any other people who were brought in, who were working with Neverland Valley Entertainment dealing with this issue?
oh, this British company, Bell something or something Bell.
Bell Yard?
Bell Yard, that's it.
And were there, in fact, conversations that you were able to overhear between Mr. Schaffel and Bell Yard in England?
Yeah, and I also saw the paperwork.
Okay. Was there now communication with Michael Jackson that you were privy to, that you were actually witness to?
Yeah,
Did that begin after this?
after.
In other words, after the screening of Living with Michael Jackson, or even, let me withdraw that question. After you and Mr. Schaffel became aware of the existence of the transcript of that show, did either you or Mr. Schaffel make the content of that transcript known to Mr. Jackson?
Mark did. Mark did to Ronald, Dieter, and Michael.
So all of them were contacted at that time?
Yes.
Alright. Now, had Ronald and Dieter been active in dealing with Mr. Schaffel in your presence during the preceding months prior to January 03?
I don't understand. Can you say that?
Were you witness to conversations between Mark Schaffel and either Ronald Konitzer or Dieter Weisner prior to January of 03?
Oh, prior to January?
Yes.
Yeah, they were. He was trying to get back into good graces with Michael, so he was talking to Frank and to Ronald and Dieter on the phone a lot.
What, did you ever have conversations with Frank or Ronald or Dieter during that period prior to January 03?
Well, Ronald and Dieter came over to the house to have meetings, like 2 meetings I remember.
Alright. And you were there at the time, is that correct?
Yeah, we had a meeting with them.
Alright. Were there any conference calls that took place in the early part of February or late part of January that involved Mr. Jackson, conference calls that you were privy to?
January 1st.
How many conference calls were there that you actually heard?
With Michael on it?
Yes.
2.
And were you actually part of the conference call?
Well, in the beginning I was sitting there. And they he put them on speakerphone. And then he kind of just wanted to make it a little more private, and I went in my office and was listening to the conference call.
Alright. Were you listening to the conference call on your phone in your office?
Yes.
We're talking about Mr. Schaffel's residence, is that correct?
Right, but I had my own office in there, and the phones were all interlinked.
And were you able to listen to the conversation in its entirety?
Yeah, because I kept notes.
You kept notes as to both those conversations?
Yes.
Alright. Was Mr. Jackson part of the conversation?
Yes. Not in the beginning, but Dieter would bring him on.
From the point that Mr. Jackson became part of the conversation, and this is the first conversation on the 1st of January, was there any discussion about Debbie Rowe in that conversation?
Objection. Leading.
Overruled.
Go ahead.
Yes.
And what was discussed about Debbie Rowe?
Objection. Vague.
Sustained.
Was there any specific discussion about Debbie Rowe being actively involved in dealing with this controversy?
Objection. Leading and vague.
I'm not sure they can be both leading and vague.
I'll allow a yes or no answer to that question. Do you know the question?
Could you state it again, please?
Perhaps the court reporter could read it back.
Yes.
Was there any specific discussion about Debbie Rowe being actively involved in dealing with this controversy?
The answer is yes.
Okay. Was Mr. Jackson asked to do something by any of the other participants in this conference call with regards to Debbie Rowe?
Objection. Leading.
Overruled. You may answer.
You can answer.
Yes.
What was he asked to do?
Call her.
Objection. Vague and hearsay.
Overruled.
And the answer is in?
Yes.
Did Mr. Jackson say something in regards to that?
Just that he wanted to know what was going on.
Did he ask that throughout that conversation?
Objection. Leading.
Sustained.
Was he told what he needed to say, or was there any discussion about what he needed to say to Debbie Rowe?
Yeah.
What was that?
Objection. Vague.
Overruled. There's an issue here for me, though, and that is who is talking.
Alright. Let me back up a question, and then we'll go back to the other one. Who was on this telephone conversation?
Dieter, Mark, and then Michael.
Now, did you know where Dieter and Michael were at the time of the conversation? That's just yes or no.
No.
And Mark, of course, was in the same residence with you?
Correct.
Who was it who was talking to Mr. Jackson about? Specifically about what he needed to do with regards to Debbie Rowe.
Mark and Dieter.
Were both of them speaking at different times with Mr. Jackson with regards to Debbie Rowe?
Together and separate.
What is it that Mark told Mr. Jackson he needed to do with regards to Debbie Rowe?
Objection. Hearsay and leading.
Overruled.
Go ahead.
He needed to call her and talk to her.
Okay.
Give her permission.
Alright, something about permission?
Uh-huh.
Okay. What did Dieter say to Mr. Jackson with regards to Debbie Rowe?
Objection. Foundation and hearsay.
Overruled.
Go ahead.
That all he needed to do was talk to her so that she could do the rebuttal.
Did Mr. Jackson say anything in that regard as to whether he would or would not do that?
No, I never knew if he even called her. So.
Alright, were you aware, from your having read the transcript, incidentally, did you ever see the documentary, Living with Michael Jackson?
Yeah, I saw it. I mean, parts 1 nodded off on, but, I saw it for what it was worth, yeah.
Did you see the portion of the documentary that specifically featured this child who was the subject of the controversy?
Oh, yeah.
Did you see it in its entirety, that section?
Oh, absolutely.
Alright, did you know the name of this family?
Yes.
Did you know how many members were in the family?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much knew there was how many people were there, yeah.
In this first conference call that you were listening to on the 1st of January, was there any discussion about the family at all?
Yes.
And what was said in the presence, at the time that Mr. Jackson was on the phone?
Objection. Vague.
Sustained.
Was Mr. Jackson asked to do anything with regard to this family?
Objection. Hearsay and vague.
Vague as to the person asking.
Okay. Did either Mr. Schaffel or Mr. It was Dieter, right? Not Ronald.
Dieter.
Dieter was on the call. Did Mr. Weisner or Mr. Schaffel ask Michael Jackson to do anything with regards to the family?
Well, Frank had told him that.
Objection. Non-responsive.
Yes, or no?
Yes.
Alright, and who was it, Dieter or Schaffel or both?
Both.
Let's start with Mr. Schaffel. What did Mr. Schaffel say with regards to Mr. Jackson with regards to this family?
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled. You may answer.
Go ahead.
That they could ruin your career, they could blackmail you.
Alright, did Mr. Weisner say anything to Mr. Jackson?
Essentially the same thing. Essentially the same thing.
Was there some discussion by either one of them as to what should be done?
On the second conference call there was a little bit better clarity there.
We'll get to that in a second. But on the first one, was there any further discussion at that point?
Not really. Not that I can remember, that I can recall. I mean, do you want me to look at my notes, or?
Would it refresh your recollection to look at your notes?
Yeah.
Did you, in fact, take notes at that time?
Yeah, at the time.
Were your notes taken contemporaneous with the event, the phone call?
Yeah, they're right here.
You have those notes with you?
Yes.
Go ahead and take a look at your notes. Don't read from them, just read them, and then close your notebook back up when you're done.
Okay.
Having reviewed your notes, did it refresh your recollection as to any other content of that conversation that specifically dealt with this family?
Yes.
Alright, and what else was said?
That.
Objection. Vague.
Let's start with either Mr. Weisner. What else was said by Mr. Weisner, if anything else?
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled. You may answer.
Weisner and Mark were essentially saying the same things back and forth. There was that urgency tone in their voice of, you have got to take care of.
Objection. Non-responsive.
Overruled. As to the tone of voice as stricken.
Let's deal specifically with Mr. Weisner, as best you can recall. Anything other than what you've told us already with regards to the Arvizo family?
Objection. Hearsay. Your Honor, was there a ruling?
I'm sorry. Yes.
What was the ruling? I'm sorry, I didn't hear it. I apologize.
Overruled.
All right.
My voice was.
Now I don't remember the question. Oh, it was dealing with Mr. Weisner, and the question of whether or not your notes refresh your recollection as to anything else that Mr. Weisner had said to Mr. Jackson concerning the Arvizo family. Am I right?
Right.
Tell us anything else you can recall having read your notes, reviewed your notes.
That they wanted to do this rebuttal and put some money in his pocket.
There was discussion about rebuttal at that point?
Yeah, that was an early concept of theirs.
All right. What specifically was the discussion about the rebuttal coming from Mr. Weisner? And then we'll talk about from Mr. Schaffel.
Objection. Hearsay.
Just rephrase the question. You've confused the witness.
Was there a conversation between Mr. Weisner and Mr. Jackson about a rebuttal?
Yes.
What did Mr. Weisner say to Mr. Jackson about a rebuttal?
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled. You may answer.
To the best of your recollection.
That they needed to do it.
Did he say why they needed to do this rebuttal?
To save Michael's image, his career.
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled.
And did he talk at all about this being a money raiser in any way?
Oh, yeah, this could make money.
And that's what Mr. Weisner said to Mr. Jackson.
Both of them did.
All right. Now, let's move to Mr. Schaffel as well. To the best of your recollection, what did Mr. Schaffel say to Mr. Jackson about doing this rebuttal film?
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled. You may answer.
Go ahead.
That, you could let the network make all the money or you could make the money. So there was an incentive.
Do you recall what Mr. Jackson said in response to that?
Well, he agreed.
Was there any discussion about whether the Arvizo family would be involved in this rebuttal?
Yes, because Michael had.
Objection. Vague.
Overruled. The answer was, yes.
All right. Tell us between which parties was there discussion about the Arvizo family being involved in this rebuttal? Who talked about the Arvizo's family participation in the rebuttal?
Oh, Michael brought it up.
And what did he say?
That Frank had told him.
That Frank had told him what?
That they could be filming the family, or that the family might be in this rebuttal special. And needed to be.
Did Mr. Jackson offer any commentary as to why the family needed to be involved in this rebuttal?
Not really. Wanted to be aware of things.
Now, this is all the first conversation, is that right, the first conference call?
Yes. Things were moving very quickly.
Objection. Move to strike.
Stricken. No question pending.
Now, the second conference call that took place, do you remember when that was?
Yeah, it was either February 2nd or 3rd. One of those days.
Within 1 to 2 days?
Yes.
Were you listening to that conversation as well?
Yes.
Were you party to the conversation? In other words, were you talking during the conversation?
No, I was just listening.
Do you know whether or not the other parties knew you were on the line?
They didn't know.
As to the first conversation on the first, do you know whether the other parties knew whether you were on the line?
He knew I was sitting there when he got them on the phone, and then I went into the other room and listened.
Did he know that you, Schaffel, you're talking about, is he, right?
Right.
Did Mr. Schaffel know that you were listening on the other line as to either of those two conversations?
No, no, the answer is no.
In the second conversation, who were the participants of that conversation?
Dieter and Michael again, and it was the same way. Dieter first and then Michael got on the phone.
In other words, initially the conversation was between Mark and Dieter?
Uh-huh.
And then Michael got on the phone?
Uh-huh.
Without getting into the content of the conversation, how long did Mark and Dieter talk before Michael got on the phone?
A couple of minutes. Just about probably, 8 or 10 minutes. And it was just rambling money crap, stuff.
That happens here every once in a while.
Oh, okay.
Could you tell if Dieter and Michael were in the same location? When Michael, Mr. Jackson got on the phone. Did they have to commence another phone call to do that, or did he simply get on the phone?
Well, initially it was like an operator, so I knew it wasn't at Neverland. But I didn't know where they were.
But did they have to use an operator again to get Mr. Jackson on the phone?
Objection. Leading.
Overruled.
Do you understand the question?
Yes. No. When Michael came on the phone, it was like he was right there.
Okay.
Or he had walked into another room, you know, if it was that kind of phone.
You said, Neverland. Did you know whether or not they were actually calling from Neverland?
No, because when you call it Neverland, they pick up and say, Neverland.
Do you know who commenced this phone call?
Mark did.
And no one said, Neverland, at the time that he called?
No, it was an operator.
Alright. After Mr. Jackson became party to this conversation that was now a conversation with Dieter and Michael Jackson and Mr. Schaffel, was there a discussion about making the video?
Objection. Leading.
Overruled. You may answer.
Just, yes, or, no.
Yes.
Who was involved in that discussion?
Dieter, Ronald, Michael.
Can you tell us what Michael Jackson said specifically about the video and making the video?
Well, he wanted to know what was going on, so he just asked it blunt, like, what's happening? What's the latest? What's going on?
And did either Dieter or Mark answer that question? That's, yes, or, no.
Yes.
Which one answered that question?
Both of them did.
What did Mark say with regards to what's going on?
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled. You may answer.
What did Mark say with regards to what's going on?
Can I look at my notes?
Would it refresh your recollection to do so?
Yes.
Alright. And if that same question dealt with Dieter, would you need to refresh your recollection as to that as well?
Yes.
Alright. Would you please refresh your recollection as to both of those? Have you reviewed your notes as to both of those conversations?
Uh-huh.
Were you able to refresh your recollection as to both of those conversations?
Yes.
What did Mr. Jackson say with regards to his conversation with Mark Schaffel as to what was going on?
Well, first.
You already answered that. I'm sorry. What did you know? I'm not sure what the question was.
It was, what did Mark say?
I'm sorry?
I think you were asking, what did Mark say?
Okay, go ahead.
What did Mark say? Well, he said that, we're going to go down to Florida, or something like that, yeah.
He made a comment about going to Florida?
Yes.
Do you recall what?
Taking the family down to Florida.
So the content of that conversation included going to Florida with the family?
Correct.
Objection. Misstates the evidence.
Overruled.
And as to Dieter, what did Dieter say specifically?
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled.
To Michael Jackson, what did Dieter say?
They needed to do a press conference.
What did Mr. Jackson say in response to doing a press conference?
That he hates doing those things.
I'm sorry?
That he hated doing those things.
Did he agree to do it?
You know, I didn't hear Michael say, yes, you know, I want to do it. He just says, I hate doing those things.
Was there any other discussion about the Arvizo family in this conversation other than that they were going to go to Florida to do a press conference?
Yeah, they were going to be with Michael and Michael wanted to go someplace fun.
What did he say specifically about going someplace fun?
He said, let's go someplace fun. I don't know, maybe the place was boring.
Was there any discussion in this second conference about being concerned about the Arvizo family?
Objection. Leading.
Overruled. You may answer.
No, but I was concerned.
Alright, but.
Objection. Move to strike. Non-responsive.
Stricken. Except for, no.
You had mentioned, as to the first conversation on the first, that there was some discussion about blackmail, is that right?
Correct.
Was there any discussion about blackmail on the second conversation, to the best of your recollection?
No, not that I can think of.
Was there any more discussion in the second conversation about Debbie Rowe's involvement in the video?
No, she was just going to do the rebuttal.
Alright, was that talked about in the second conversation at all?
No.
At some point in time, Did you become aware of the fact that there was going to be an interview with Debbie Rowe?
Oh, yeah.
Did you learn about that prior to the commencement of that interview?
Could you say that again?
Before the interview actually took place, did you know that that interview was going to happen?
Oh, yeah.
How long prior to the commencement of the interview?
A couple days. It was going quick.
Do you know when that interview took place relative to, say, the second phone call?
Actually, a couple days later, I believe. Yeah.
Do you know where that interview took place?
Yeah, I was there. It was at Mark's house.
Do you know for what period of time that interview took place? How long did it last?
It went on for forever. It was like 8, 9 hours, something like that.
Do you know approximately what time it started and approximately what time it ended?
It seemed like it just went on all day. There was a lot of setup. Hamid had to come in and set up. So if you're talking that started early. And then, we didn't get out of there until the sun went down, really, so.
And was Debbie Rowe there the entire time?
No, not in the beginning, because that's all set up. Microphones, lighting, the cameras.
You said Hamid was there. Who is Hamid? Do you know his full name?
Hamid Molesi or Maleshi.
And what does he do?
He was Michael's personal videographer, photographer.
If I referred to Hamid as Mr. Moslehi,
Moslehi.
would that sound close enough?
I always mispronounced his name, so yeah.
I think everybody does. Who else was there besides Mr. Moslehi?
Iris, her attorney.
Whose attorney?
Debbie Rowe's attorney.
Do you know Iris's last name?
Silver something.
Does Finsilver sound right?
Finsilver.
And then Debbie was there?
Uh-huh.
Alright. And who else was there?
Christian. Ian Drew.
Is this Christian Robinson we're talking about?
Yes.
Christian Robinson was still working.
Oh, yeah.
For Neverland Valley Entertainment?
Oh, yes.
And the workplace for Christian Robinson continued to be Mr. Schaffel's residence?
Correct.
And he was there on that occasion?
Yes.
Was he actually involved in this interview with Debbie Rowe?
Well, he was working, yeah. I mean, doing some sideline things and helping to assist camera work and stuff.
Was Mark Schaffel there?
Yes.
We have Christian Robinson, Mark Schaffel, Iris Joan, Hamid. You were there, is that correct?
Uh-huh.
Who else was there? Anybody else you can think of?
Stuart Backerman.
Was he there for the entire time?
Yeah, everybody stayed for the entire time.
Anybody else?
Not that I can think of. I mean, there was camera. I think Hamid had some camera guys, but.
Who actually conducted the interview?
Ian Drew.
Now, were you witness to any part of this interview?
Yeah, I would come upstairs and downstairs and watch, and then get bored and go back upstairs, and then come down.
Did you watch at times for extended periods?
Yeah, to see what was said and how it was going to be performed or whatever.
Over the entirety of the time that this interview took place, what percentage of it do you believe you actually witnessed?
Probably 75% of it, because I was going up and down. You couldn't help it, it was just happening right there, so.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
Yes.
I'm going to show you exhibit number 888. 888, you would agree, is a photograph?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell us the content of the photograph, the subject matter?
It's the interview that's happening in the house. Mark's home.
Can you identify the people who are in that photograph?
Yes.
Alright. Who are they?
Debbie Rowe, Ian Drew sitting across from her, Mark to the right in the blue shirt, and Christian Robinson to the left.
Does that appear to be a photograph that was taken during the course of that interview?
Oh, absolutely.
Alright. Are all of those people identified accurately as the subject of that photograph?
Yes.
And is that photograph, in fact, an accurate depiction of the subject matter contained within?
I guess so, yeah.
I would move to introduce 888 into evidence.
No objection.
Alright. In that photograph, do you see Mr. Schaffel doing something?
It's admitted.
Your Honor, can I publish the photograph?
Yes.
And can you identify those people again, please?
Yes. By pointing?
Do we have that laser? Yeah, right there.
This is a laser?
It is.
All right.
Don't start playing with it. Point out, please, Debbie Rowe for us. Point out Ian Drew for us. A simple point would be adequate. Point out Mark Schaffel, if you would, please. And point out Christian Robinson. Okay, can you tell what Mr. Schaffel is doing at that time?
He's working on the questions and answers.
Did you actually see documents that you believed to be questions and answers?
Well, initially they were just questions, because they were sent over by Ian Drew. And then they became questions and answers.
Now, you say, were sent over by Ian Drew. Ian Drew was actually there at that time. Do you mean sometime prior to this interview?
Oh, yeah, because Ian was upset that Mark hadn't responded to him right away.
Objection. Non-responsive. Hearsay. Move to strike.
Strike the last sentence.
Were questions received by Mark Schaffel at Neverland Valley Entertainment headquarters, at Mr. Schaffel's residence, prior to the commencement of this interview?
Yes. 100 questions.
Did those questions also contain suggested answers?
Objection. Foundation.
Sustained.
Did you see the questions at the time they came from Mr. Drew?
He printed them and had them on the desk.
And you looked at them?
Yeah, I just looked at them quickly.
You were able to see how many questions roughly, is that correct?
Well, yeah, there was 100. There was about 100. 90 to 100.
Were they numbered, the questions?
Well, actually, Mark complained there were so many questions. I said, how many questions? And he said, about 100.
Alright, but you did actually look at it at one point?
Yes, it was sitting on his desk.
And at that time that it came in, were there answers associated with those questions?
Not at the time.
At a later time, were there answers associated with those questions?
Objection. Foundation.
Sustained.
Did you see the document at a later time?
Yes.
Did that document change over time?
Uh-huh.
How did it change?
There was answers.
Prior to the commencement of this interview, were there answers as part of that document?
Well, it was changing. So Ian Drew sent over the questions. And it changed. And then there were answers.
During the course of the interview, what was Mr. Schaffel's involvement?
He was like the producer. He was like the director.
Alright, was he making any suggestions one way or the other?
Oh, yeah.
In what way?
Objection. Hearsay.
Is that a request for him to repeat what was said, or, I'll ask for a different question?
I'm sorry.
In what way, is the question I find vague.
Alright. What was Mr. Schaffel saying to Debbie Rowe during the course of this interview?
Objection. Hearsay.
It's overly broad. It's sustained.
Was Mr. Schaffel making any suggestions as to how to answer the questions to Debbie Rowe?
Objection is leading.
Overruled. You may answer.
Yes.
In what way? What was he saying?
Objection. Hearsay.
It's not for the truth of the matter stated.
The objection is overruled.
Tell us in what way.
He would prod her to do it better or say it better, like any producer would.
How often did he do that with regards to the questions, the frequency with which the questions were asked? How often would he offer suggestions?
A lot. That's what, he was there the whole time and he was working on things at the same time. He would write things and scratch it out and then she would redo it.
Was Debbie Rowe responsive to his suggestions?
Yes.
Was she changing her answers in accordance with his directions?
Objection. Hearsay and leading.
Calls for a conclusion. Sustained.
Did she make changes in any answers at any time during those interviews?
Objection. Foundation. Hearsay.
Sustained.
Did you hear any discussions about?
It's not the foundation. You're asking him to conclude. When she says A and then says B, that's a change in testimony. Not in testimony, but in statement. So it's opinion, and I'm not allowing that.
Okay.
If you want to give some examples,
I can do that.
you can do that.
Mr. Provencio, were there some subject matters that you recall at this time that were the subject of this discussion, this interview?
Yeah, well, like when she was.
Objection. Non-responsive.
That's yes or no.
Yes.
Move to strike.
Do you recall specifically that there was a discussion about the quality of Mr. Jackson's parenting of his children?
Objection. Leading.
For a reason.
The objection is overruled.
Were there any discussions about the quality of Mr. Jackson's parenting of his children?
Well, that Debbie said?
Questions that were put to Debbie Rowe about exactly that.
Yes.
Were those questions subject to Mr. Schaffel's suggestions?
Yes, because he would.
Objection. Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled.
All right. Do you remember a question in specific that dealt with that topic that was eventually commented on by Mr. Schaffel?
That Michael was a good father, and then he said, "You're going to see your kids."
Do you recall having heard that?
Objection. Non-responsive. Move to strike.
Sustained. The question was whether or not you remember a question, not what the response was.
Okay.
All right. Was there an answer specifically that Debbie Rowe gave to that issue of the quality of Mr. Jackson's parenting that Mr. Schaffel wanted to change?
Objection. Calls for speculation, hearsay, and a conclusion.
Sustained.
Was there a conversation about her seeing her children?
Well.
Objection. Leading.
Overruled.
You may answer.
He said, "You're going to see your kids soon."
Objection. Non-responsive. Hearsay. Move to strike.
It's stricken.
Well, but the answer would be yes or no. Was there a conversation specifically about her kids?
Yes.
What did Mr. Schaffel say to her about her kids?
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled.
Go ahead.
That, "You were doing good. You were going to see them soon," or something like that.
Were there times when you were watching this interview when Miss Rowe was crying?
Yes.
Was there any discussion between Mr. Schaffel and Ms. Rowe about her crying at other times?
Yes.
Would you explain that to us, please?
Objection. Hearsay. Vague.
Overruled. You may answer.
Go ahead.
Can you say it again?
Perhaps the court reporter would read it back.
Was there any discussion between Mr. Schaffel and Ms. Rowe about her crying at other times? Would you explain that to us, please?
Okay. He thought she could cry better.
And did they do the scene again?
Pretty much, yeah. Well, not pretty much. They did.
And did she cry when they redid it?
She cried better.
She cried better. Did you eventually see this production of the Maury Povich rebuttal?
Yes.
Were there, in fact, scenes of Debbie Rowe in this production?
Yes.
Were any of the scenes which included her crying?
Yeah, there was like a crying scene.
During the course of the interview, did you receive phone calls at the house from a Mark Garrigus?
Yes.
Were you able to overhear those conversations?
Well, he would get on the phone with Mark.
Yes or no?
Yes, sorry.
You were able to overhear the conversations?
Yes.
How could you overhear the conversations?
Because sometimes they were on speakerphone, and sometimes, he just.
Did he call more than once?
Oh, yeah.
And can you give us a sense of how often he called? How frequently he called during that time?
Well, he was calling, in a week's time, he was calling 3 or 4 times that I would know for sure that was him, because I could hear his voice. And then if Vinny was there, he called a lot.
All right. And we're talking at the moment during the course of the interview, the Debbie Rowe interview.
Oh, if we're talking towards the interview, he was calling a couple of times, yes.
Vinny was not there during that interview, is that correct?
I don't believe he was, no.
But at subsequent times Vinny was. Vinny, amen, is that right?
Vinny, amen.
And Vinny was there at the house subsequent to that interview, is that correct?
Yes.
And you testified that there were conversations with Mr. Garrigus and Vinny, amen?
Correct.
Your Honor, this might be a good time to take a break, if that's okay.
All right, we'll take our break.